Who wants to hear me talk about the scenting and sensing of female arousal in fantasy romance and romantasy? Everyone does, I knew it. Also, if you answered no, I feel like that just requires some unpacking and self-interrogation on your part, and if you dig deep enough, you will realize you too want to talk about this, because this is incredibly normal to think about for 3 days straight. So what I am referring to is the ability to literally smell the physiological bodily response of a woman and draw the conclusion that she is aroused, and or the ability to sense through some sort of magical bond the fact of her arousal. This is something that seems to be somewhat of a trending thing at the moment in romantasy and in fantasy romance, particularly in books where gender and bioessentialist world-building is present. That often shows up in the way that men and women are referred to with language like male and female. Oftentimes the people who are using terms like male and female are not exactly human, so they will be fae, for example. Throughout this essay, as a result of that fact, I will be using the terms male, female, man, woman interchangeably. I promise this is on purpose and I'm not being weird about gender. This is just relevant language, and these are the terms that are most often used in conjunction with this narrative device. Side note as well, you will find the script to this video, including footnotes with sources, down in the description below. I am also trying to balance looking at you through my camera. I'm also looking at me because I like talking to myself, I guess, and I'm also looking at my script beside my phone because of technology reasons. So if I'm all over the place, don't pay attention to that. I promise it's fine. So one of the reasons why I have been fixating on this topic recently is because I personally, as a humble individual with thoughts and feelings and opinions, I just don't like this thing. This is not me trying to ascribe some sort of morality to it. It's just genuinely, I don't really enjoy reading it. I think it's really uncomfortable. That's a personal thing. I also just, I don't know. I think because it's such a heavily gendered thing, not only in the ways that it's depicted, but who is depicting it, this is very interesting to me. Romantasy is obviously a subgenre, many of us know, that is predominantly written by women, for women, and about women. And so I think in fantasy, where you can virtually imagine anything that you like, I'm really interested in unpacking or like looking at the choice to depict this thing, both in a general sense, but I'm also interested in unpacking it precisely because it elicits very specific feelings in me as an individual, such as, for example, discomfort, mortification. I think if this were a real thing that I had to experience, I would just check out of life, to be honest. It also brings up feelings of unsafety or like genuine concern and worry about the female character's safety, but we will get more into that as the video or this essay thing progresses. So to begin, this is showing up in a lot of male-female romance pairing books in romantic fantasy at the moment, as I mentioned already, and I want to briefly explore some of the different ideological relations in regards to like textual traditions in romance and its subgenres, because there is one thing that I am thinking about quite often in regards to romance and its subgenres, and that is the eroticization of dominance and submission. So in this context, dominance, I am referring to the functional asymmetry between characters, and by submission, I am referring to the act of ceding control or authority to another. This isn't depicted always as explicitly as you might think. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the ways a particular brand of feminism, parentheses, girl boss feminism, mean girl feminism, for example, is being portrayed in romantasy these days. So the idea is that these women submit to nobody. They are extremely strong. She is sassy. She is equal to men, if not better. She can kick ass. Surely that is not a dominant submission narrative, right? Well, what I am referring to here is something that I think is actually a little or a lot more subtle, perhaps, and that has to do with the power imbalances that are often depicted in relationships wherein this scenting or sensing of arousal is showing up. Unfortunately, and I mean this genuinely, it is my extreme and supreme displeasure to mention that there is in fact a peer-reviewed study from the University of Kent that found that men can indeed, in some ways through smell, sense arousal in women. Quote, "Findings were established through 3 different experiments where men processed the scents of auxiliary sweat samples from anonymous sexually aroused and non-aroused women. Men evaluated the scent of sexually aroused women as relatively more attractive, and this increased their sexual motivation. This suggests that the chemical signals of scent alone can elicit a sexual response in recipients. Yes, I also hate that. So this kind of thing that's being depicted into a, I don't know how to phrase this, like hyper degree, does indeed have some basis in reality as we currently understand it. I wish so badly that this weren't true, but here we are but animals. I also wanted to note that this study was conducted on only men who identified as heterosexual, and the women involved did not need to declare their sexuality, so as my good friend Henry beautifully paraphrased, some lesbians may have been smelled. You can do with that what you will. I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least briefly talk about the way that rape and sexual assault has been used and depicted by female authors historically as a way of engaging with narratives around gendered expectations, sex, and female desire. To begin, some romance scholars have claimed even that the depiction of rape and sexual assault in older romance is in some ways feminist or was feminist for the time. For example, it's a way for female characters to experience sex without the guilt and shame associated with wanting it. If we look at debates as well surrounding rape taking place in the 1970s, we can also view some depictions of rape and sexual assault in books published around that time as responses to these debates, speaking to a social context that encouraged the exploration and depiction of such events. And this also offers us a better understanding both of the novels and also of the society from which they came. I think the same can absolutely be said not only for romance genre books and romance subgenre books, but just books in general of today, because absolutely nothing is created in a vacuum as much as some people might like to think that it is. Thus, my questions are, for this video, why this and why now? Why is this period of fantasy romance so focused on this narrative device? Why is it trending in this precise point in time? The answers, I think, partially lie in what is taking place in society right now. So, for example, we are living in a time where women's rights to bodily autonomy and abortion care in the USA are being taken away actively. Fascism is also on the rise actively. Time and time again, we are also seeing that victims of sexual assault are not getting justice, and not only that, but the perpetrators of these crimes are being granted things like parental rights. Hello? They're also being granted things like being voted President of the United States. What a world we live in. These people are keeping their jobs, and they are often more supported in the public eye and on social media and things like in the public opinion, I guess, than the people that they've harmed, etc., etc. The list goes on. A popular perception among fantasy romance readers, at least insofar as I have seen, namely on Book Talk most recently, especially after the recent US election, is that romance and fantasy novels are a space for escapism purely. Some people even going so far as to say that we shouldn't be bringing politics into book spaces. We shouldn't be bringing politics into the context of these books. But to that, I humbly and somewhat awkwardly and afraid of conflictedly say that romance and fantasy are also places of political interrogation. These books give us a reason or a vessel through which to explore both what is being depicted and what we are currently being impacted by in real life. I also just believe that books are not just reaction to discussions and movements that are happening in real life. I think that they actively engage with them, and in some cases they even initiate them. And all of these happen sometimes in productive ways, sometimes in destructive ways. Further, in bookish spaces of the internet, there is a big trend in literature as well right now, and a big portion of the writing community that is extremely interested in and primarily seeking out stories that feature morally dubious or just outright dangerous and bad men, with some even going so far as to say they voted for Donald Trump, a known sex offender, because they thought we liked morally grey men, which I can't even let an awkward pause hang there because there is a plethora of fantasy romance at the moment that features quite sexual themes and content, and I'm really interested in exploring how this kind of informs the scenting and sensing of women's arousal in these genres, and also how this narrative device is informed by real-world things, as well as how it might go on to inform real-world things. First, I would like to talk about some of the thoughts I had about this narrative device in relation to power, or perhaps more specifically, power imbalances. I think that this trope, more often than not, tips the power scales in the favor of the man, and one reason for this is that she arousal, but he can smell hers. And this is, again, often because he is not actually human, he is something with a supernatural smelling ability. But there are a few more reasons why I think the power balance skews in his favor, and I have a numbered list for you because I'm so fancy. First is, there is an aspect of privacy that is stripped away. So the woman does not have the ability to hide the state of her arousal when people around her can just smell it on her. There is also a level of undeniability about it because it's simply there in the open. It's also not something that she can control or really obscure without going to great effort, and more often than not, she doesn't even know how to begin trying to obscure it, nor does she make the effort to. And this is not to imply that it should be hidden or that it should be a source of shame, it's just a thing that I have observed does not happen. This is a quote from A Kingdom of Flesh and Fire by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Castile could sense arousal. Heat swept over every inch of my body, and I knew I had to be as red as the leaves within the blood forest. Oh gods, that explained how he seemed to know exactly when I was lying about being attracted to him. But could he sense that from a distance? I doubted that. How is that even possible? Each person has a unique scent. At certain times, the scent is stronger, especially when someone is aroused. My second point to this is that the man is portrayed as like suffering in some way. Sometimes even the word suffering is used because her scent turns him on to such a degree. And he's also framed as like a really good guy for resisting the urge to. In many ways, the choice to depict it this way kind of makes him a character whose strength and like power and respect for women, I guess, is like reinforced quite explicitly. So he is implicitly strong and powerful for resisting his biological urges, his needs. It makes him also a little sympathetic because of the suffering aspect, right? So he might be experiencing pain or discomfort, like fantasy hyper painful blue balls in the pursuit specifically of not pressuring her into doing anything she doesn't want to do. And lastly, it functions as another way of making him seem more desirable both to the female character in question and also to readers. We like it when a man respects a woman's bodily autonomy. 3. The male character can and often does lord the fact of the woman's arousal over her. So for example, in enemies to lovers, dislike to lovers, rivals to lovers, whatever it might be, the male character often has some sort of cocky dialogue exchange wherein he exploits his knowledge of her body by saying something to the effect of, "You hate me, but I know you want me." 4. This kind of positions him as somewhat of an authority over her body and experience. He knows her better than she knows herself in some ways. She just needs to let her mind catch up with her, quote, molten core. In a lot of these books, her body's arousal response is used to excuse some boundary-crossing behaviors of which she is most often the victim, and her arousal is simply proof that she does indeed want him, whether she will admit that to him or admit it to herself or not. 5, and lastly, there is a kind of predator and prey aspect to this depiction. Oftentimes it's explicit, so the man is not a human, but he is a fae or something, and he's described with verbs such as pounced, stalked, claimed. He is also even sometimes explicitly described with the word predator, or he is metaphorized with predator animals such as wolves. Meanwhile, or conversely, the woman is described with prey animal imagery such as hares and deer. She is also sometimes explicitly submissive in her actions, so she might be backing up, making herself small, or being physically overpowered by the man in question. This is an example from A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. He chuckled bitterly. The moonlight turned his eyes to the color of leaves in shadow. More. I wanted the hardness of his body crushing against mine. I wanted his mouth and teeth and tongue on my bare skin, on my breasts, between my legs. Everywhere. I wanted him everywhere. I was drowning in that need. His nostrils flared as he scented me, scented every burning, raging thought that was pounding through my body, my senses. The breath rushed from him in a mighty whoosh. He growled once, low and frustrated and vicious, before prowling away. In trying to have a well-rounded view of this topic, I tried to think of some reasons why this trope or narrative device or world-building element, whatever we want to call it, might be appealing to some readers and writers, and I came up with 3 big thoughts, but I am really curious to know if this will resonate with anyone, if people will agree or not agree, why not. I would really love to see some comments. This is not a plea for engagement, by the way. I'm literally just desperate to understand. So the first thing I thought of about the scenting or sensing of arousal is that it removes an obstacle to bringing up the matter of attraction and sexual desire. So basically, if he knows that she is turned on around him, that is often treated as a reason or a way that they can communicate less in regards to who they want and when. It's treated as a kind of door that is opening and implicitly suggests some sort of willingness for a sexual encounter of some kind. I think, just generally speaking, that cutting corners on the need to communicate is something that I see a lot in romance and romance subgenres. So, for example, we will have male characters anticipating and predicting the female character's wants and needs in ways that are unrealistic or that don't make sense given the scope of what we know that he knows. Or he might, for example, be super good at sex, and so he knows exactly what to do with little to no direction from his female partner. So in that vein, I kind of wonder if this is one of those things. This is a quote from The High Mountain Court by A.K. Mulford. Hale's nostrils flared, smelling her arousal. The scent made his entire body shudder. Remy vibrated in anticipation. The promise held in those wild grey eyes set her aflame. The second thing I considered is how this kind of narrative device acts as a kind of shorthand. So it provides a strong clue to the reader as to what is going to come in the novel. Pun not intended. So once readers have recognized that the man arousing her is likely the love interest, this is a big clue. In fact, more often than not, you can absolutely 100% identify who the love interest is or will be based on the affect of his appearance or physical proximity on her, physiologically speaking, more specifically, her arousal response. I also tangentially have a lot of thoughts about the overuse and conflation of sexual desire and romance in a lot of fantasy romance books, and this desire, or like this device, I mean, feels like a good manifestation of that, because by its very existence, readers are primed to expect a romantic relationship to eventuate, and it will be heavily sexual. This is like the genre convention, and this is not inherently problematic on its own. I would like to be clear about that, but I do think it is worth critically thinking about, especially in the context of stories where very little romantic and personal intimacy is built outside of that sexual compatibility and sexual activity. The romance heavily centers sexual desire and fulfillment, sometimes even going so far as to have characters think that previous relationships that they thought were love must not have actually been love because the sex wasn't as good and because they weren't experiencing the same level of arousal. But that is a topic for a whole other essay, I think. My third and final thought to this point is something to do with how rape and sexual assault was used in older romances, specifically in ways that allowed writers to depict sexual content and also allowed female characters to enjoy sex without the guilt associated with breaking social norms and expectations and rules. I kind of wonder if this narrative device or trope is used at least in part for reasons that are similar. I see it sometimes used in conjunction with narratives that attempt to depict female sexual empowerment or female empowerment through acceptance of their sexual desires. Thus, they quite explicitly play with the issue of their arousal being somewhat public knowledge, but that is just a turn in the wheel, I guess, of her sexual awakening or her journey to learning how to express herself sexually without shame. In books where this is not being depicted, where this is not the narrative really, I'm not sure how relevant this point is, but I do think further to that, this narrative device does something for the romantic narrative in a way that alleviates some unknowing, right? Like in the example that I previously read, there is a sense of reciprocity to it. Also, when the male can scent or sense her arousal, he is almost always receptive to that in some way. Even in dynamics where the two characters involved don't seem to like each other, he very, very often seems very willing to potentially engage in some sort of sexual act with her. Further, romance feels like a comfort genre to me in many ways. It's a genre that has some pretty strict rules about what can and should happen. For example, the happily for now or happily ever after ending. So the promise of the premise of romance is that a romantic pairing will be there at some point at the end. And I think that this narrative device kind of helps make that like immediately clear, but it also acts as like a teasing or like titillation of the spicy sexual content to come. This is indeed the part of the video where I talk about arousal being depicted in this way, not as a bodily response that isn't indicative of desire. It's always indicative of desire. This is how the narratives always treat it. So arousal non-concordance, if you are unfamiliar with the term, it refers to when a woman experiences lubrication. The situations that this happens in can be quite uncomfortable, but they are simply a physiological response. They are not inherently indicators of sexual desire, sexual arousal, or of actually being in the mood or wanting to engage in sexual activity. However, as I just said, all of the books that I've read with this narrative device in it do not treat it this way. The concept of arousal non-concordance is essentially a non-concept. It's not even considered a possibility, even when the female character is thinking no. The smell of her arousal is often an indicator that she does actually want the man, and even when she is thinking that she doesn't, which would in real life indicate or even be just straight up arousal non-concordance, the narrative treats it as genuine sexual arousal and also as a sign that them is an inevitability and that her mind just needs to catch up with her body. This is the whole her mind and her mouth said no but her body said yes thing that I will be getting to further on in this essay thing. This is also more often than not treated as something that is just not in any way really that uncomfortable. There is discomfort. It's discomfort at the moment of finding out that he can smell her arousal, but beyond that there is very little meaningful conflict within the female character's embodied experience about that mismatch between her body's reaction and her mind's reaction. And that is to say nothing of the man's experience. He is just most often depicted as being desirous of fulfilling his sexual urges, but he is always, of course, holding back somewhat out of lack of consent. For all that the woman can be pinned to the ground and holding a knife to his throat or his gut, and for all that she can be explicitly telling him to off, her body is reacting with arousal, and readers are not ever really asked to see that for the complex and uncomfortable thing that it can be, because neither are the characters. It's merely a tiny obstacle, like a nuisance to be overcome, and it's barely an inconvenience. So I'm afraid we couldn't talk about this topic without also diving into a little bit of rape culture discussion. That's just the way that the cookie crumbles, and I fear that rape culture is actually a pretty big ingredient that often lacks consideration in regards to this subject, both in its depiction in fiction and also in discourse around it. So rape culture is a culture where sexual violence and abuse is normalized and downplayed, where it is accepted, excused, laughed off, and not challenged enough by society as a whole. It's a culture that turns sexual assault, rapes, and other forms of violence against women into entertainment or to altogether ignore or trivialize these crimes. So in a society where rape culture is so prevalent, the blame for any sexual crimes and harm is usually put on the woman, i.e. the demographic that is statistically more likely to be the victim. There are a lot of sentiments that I personally grew up hearing in real life and then later seeing online when I was allowed access to social media, such as, but not limited to, "It's not rape if you like it," "She was asking for it," "What was she wearing?" "No woman can be raped against her will," "She led him on." And in thinking about the issue of scenting and sensing female arousal to the degree that it can be scented or sensed in fantasy romance these days, I had a really big confronting question, and that was, in a world where people can scent your arousal, in what ways would that be used against you? Today, victims of rape and sexual assault often expect to be disbelieved by the people in the systems tasked with protecting us. Many victims have also been on the record as having stated that they felt like police officers and people in general often display, quote, "a disbelieving or insensitive attitude" about the assault being reported or shared. And indeed, online we can often see a lot of public discourse around stories of sexual violence being met with extreme skepticism and victim blaming. In a world where you have a physiological response that is automatically taken to some degree as a genuine desire or even eagerness for sexual activity, what power do you have in seeking justice for being touched or acted upon inappropriately? In these books, the man or the male is seen and or framed as something of a good egg precisely because he doesn't engage in non-consensual penetrative acts with the female protagonist unless she verbally consents. However, I have 2 points I would like to make here. Firstly, that doesn't really feel like something we should be holding up so highly. Not assaulting someone is just the bare minimum. I'm not going to give you accolades for that. You should not be assaulting people, full stop. Secondly, sometimes these men are still actually perpetrating forms of assault. The narrative just doesn't treat them that way. So when the male pins the woman to a wall and there is friction going on because for some reason he thrust his leg or his coochie just happened to line up with her coochie and things are happening, That is uncomfortable and that is assault. That is a violation of physical boundaries. When he bites her, when he licks her, when he otherwise violates her physical boundaries, like I said, that is assault. That is not a safe man to be around. Just because he doesn't rape doesn't mean he's innocent, doesn't mean he's great, doesn't mean he's not doing the wrong thing, but these narratives often treat his actions with less scrutiny than I think they deserve, precisely because even though her mind is saying no, her body is saying yes. And we have to remember, guys, this is romance, so it's all gonna work out in the end. It's fine, really, it's no big deal. These exchanges or encounters, I believe, demonstrate some problematic dynamics of consent. So by having a physiological arousal response, this is often treated as though the woman has given unspoken, implicit, or indicated permission for the man to view her body in a hypersexualized way, and also to make the assumption, often not actually even incorrect, that she does desire him and is open to his advances in some capacity. He never really faces any consequences or even really takes accountability for touching her inappropriately if it does happen. In fact, the very fact of him touching her inappropriately is often brought up in sequences wherein the female character is growing aroused or desirous again just at the memory. In this vein, the violation of boundaries and inappropriate touch, I feel like, is presented as a love interest perpetrated act that can be easily excused, and it presents the act or acts as excusable precisely because they are committed by the right person. So I have a lot of thoughts about how much heavy lifting the label of romance does for some people. I think that because of the promises inherent to the genre, such as the happily ever after, the happy for now, the very fact of the eventuating romantic relationship, there is often a level of dissonance in the depiction of some things. So as I have previously mentioned, as I'm sure everybody followed along with, it's obviously a thing that some very questionable and problematic stuff is depicted often in romance, but it's just not ever really acknowledged as being potentially bad or harmful or traumatic. So for example, when it's the love interest who is sensing or scenting the arousal, and acting on it, kind of hot, it's flirting, it's not really a danger, it's just a precursor to eventual sex. But when it's any other character or any other person, it's uncomfortable, and it's used to make both the woman and the readers understand the female character's vulnerability in that situation. Even in situations, and this is a real thing that I read with my own two eyeballs last year in a romantasy, even in situations that feel extremely questionable, for example, waking up to someone you've never expressed desire to be within any sexual capacity with their hand between your legs, who then realizes you're awake and then rolls over and pins you under them without any actual communication. It just had me thinking a lot about the dangers of being anybody in that situation, but obviously I am a woman, so I was thinking about it in like the context of being a woman in that situation, and it got me thinking about how the fear that one would reasonably feel in a situation like that is often not present at all, and if it is present, then it is always like superseded by the fact of the arousal. I think that readers and the object of the male character's desire give the man the benefit of the doubt that this will not turn into a traumatic situation so much. And this, of course, ignores the fact that for many, the very fact of being vulnerable without consent in a situation like that is pretty traumatizing in and of itself. The arousal on behalf of the woman, on behalf of the man, just everyone is kind of treated as some form of an implicit yes, and so in some ways we're actually working backwards from a place of presupposed or assumed consent. I am also thinking about how in these fictional worlds where patriarchy and violence against women is an explicit part of the world building, often it's something directly confronted and called out in various ways because of the hashtag girlboss feminism of it all. It feels very odd to me personally that a narrative device like this is treated with such little import and weight and complexity, and I feel like it's also odd that these men are given so much grace for acting the way that they do in relation to this scenting or sensing of women's arousal. So I think those were all of my thoughts on this extremely harrowing topic. I'm so glad you all came along with me. If you made it to the end, please do some sort of self-care ritual. I think I will be doing that. In the meantime, I am going to put a question to you, which is, I want to know what you think. Does this appeal to you? Why not? Do you have any critical thoughts about it? Have I missed some huge factor or perspective? I'm genuinely very interested in hearing more perspectives on this. Again, you will find my to the Google Doc down below, which has my script, my sources, my footnotes, if you're interested in that. And now I think I'm gonna go wash my brain and my eyes in the sink. Goodbye.